Before we get started, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so that you don't miss any of the content that is released by GoCollect. And if you're interested, head over to Regie Collects here on YouTube. Regie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector and the host of the GoCollect speculation video, and I want to welcome you to another episode. In this episode, we are going to spend some time taking a look at 6 blog posts that are available on the GoCollect.com website. In this first blog post, our blogger takes a look at 3 characters that are emerging on the scene. And to some degree or another, these characters are younger versions of characters that we've been seeing on the screen thus far. The very first character that our blogger talks about is Kate Bishop, who is going to take on the mantle of Hawkeye. And over the last couple of weeks, we've actually seen photos leak from the set showing Hawkeye from the movies and Kate Bishop on scene filming this series that is going to be coming out on the Disney Plus streaming service. Kate Bishop's first appearance was actually in Young Avengers issue number 1. Now, our blogger points out here that this book has actually spiked in value, and so speculators may be out of this one, but this could be something that investors want to take a look at if they believe that there is some long-term potential with Kate as Hawkeye. The next character that our blogger talks about is Kamala Khan, and I have a newfound appreciation for this character after having seen the documentary on the Disney Plus streaming service called 616. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you check it out. But the blogger basically highlights 2 books that you may want to consider if you believe that there is some future potential for Kamala Khan. The very first book that is identified is Miss Marvel issue number 1, and the second, Captain Marvel issue number 14. The blogger actually takes an additional step and recommends a third book that you may want to consider, primarily because this third book has a relatively small number of books on the CGC census, which basically means that there could be some really good potential for this book. The book specifically is Captain Marvel issue number 14, but the variant, and at present there are only 50 copies of this book on the CGC census. The third character that the blogger takes a look at is Miles Morales, who had his first appearance in Ultimate Fallout issue number 4. This is a book that is extremely hot and has been for a healthy amount of 2020. And there are a lot of people out there that believe that this book still has a lot of runway ahead of it because of all of the investment that Marvel is putting into this character. As I mentioned to you before, all of the blog posts that I'm going to be talking about in this episode are linked down in the description. I encourage you to check it out and read this one for yourself. There is a tremendous amount of excitement around Spider-Man and the Spider-Verse, and there is a lot of speculation as to what the future holds with multiverses and all of that kind of stuff. And our next blogger actually examines that theory and does it in a slightly contrarian way to maybe how it's been discussed thus far. The blogger basically explains that Doctor Strange is the key to unlocking a lot of the multiverse potential with Spider-Man. And to that point, he basically says, instead of speculating on individual characters, why not speculate on a story arc or books that are tied to story arcs that could potentially be used as sources of information for the movies? And so for his part, he actually examines several books that could potentially be used. If you believe that there is some magic to be made, you may want to check out this blog post So one of the great things about comics is all of the wonderful debates that we get to have with one another, especially if you're debating someone that happens to have an opposing viewpoint, like a Marvel person versus a DC person, right? And having that age-old debate of who stole from whom first. And what I'm specifically talking about is who came first when you start to look at some of these really awesome characters that exist at Marvel and DC that are very similar to one another. Our next blogger actually examines some of these age-old who came first arguments. And I want to break some of these down for you, and then I'm going to leave a couple of them hanging out there to see how you guys respond down in the comment section. The very first pair that we are going to examine is Darkseid versus Thanos. And again, this is an age-old argument that I don't think there's any confusion about. I think that everyone recognizes that Darkseid definitely came before and he influenced Thanos. And so to that point, we know that Darkseid appeared in Forever People issue number 1, which was printed in 1971, and Thanos appeared in Iron Man issue number 55 in 1973. Next up, we examine Namor versus Aquaman, and the question, of course, is who came first? And if you know your history, you probably know that Namor did indeed precede Aquaman. Namor first appeared in Motion Picture Funnies Weekly in April of 1939. Aquaman appeared later in More Funny Comics issue number 73 in November of 1941. Next up, we take a look at the Mercenaries, specifically Deadpool and Deathstroke. Who came first? Again, if you know your history, you probably already know that Deathstroke came first, and he appeared in Teen Titans issue number 2 in December of 1980, and Deadpool came about 11 years later in New Mutants issue number 98 in February of 1991. Now it's time to test your knowledge, and I'm going to give you 3 different pairs, and I'm interested to see if you know who came first. The first pair is Imperiex versus Galactus. Next, Flash versus Quicksilver. And last, the Atom versus Ant-Man. Down in the comment section, let me know what you think. Over the last month or so, we've seen a few instances where some preview magazines have actually increased in value substantially. And our next blogger is basically pointing out where you may not want to throw away those previews or ads where characters are actually being shown that eventually have some appearances a little bit later. I will tell you that with a couple of these, I was actually surprised at the values associated with some of these previews and ads, and I am actually going to be making a trip to storage to see whether I can find some of these books in my own collection. The very first series of books that the blogger actually talks about are attached to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and everything touching the Turtles right now is super hot. In fact, the Turtles were actually featured in 3 separate ads for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles issues number 1, and the most important of which might be Gobbledygook issue number 1. And this book is a pretty tough book to find, and at present there is only one graded copy that has been sold at an 8.5 that was actually signed by Kevin Eastman, and this book commanded a whopping $26,000 on December 10th of 2020. Now the next at is a far cry from $26,000, but it is fetching a couple of bucks, and we are specifically talking about Comics Journal issue number 89, which has an ad featuring Leonardo for TMNT issue number 1. And this book actually had a sale recently in November at a 9.2 for around $1,250. The blogger goes on to talk about a few other preview type books that you may want to check out. A couple of them are associated with Venom. There's also some associated with Harley Quinn and also Judge Dredd. As I mentioned, this blog post is linked down in the description. This next blog post is an interesting one because the blogger basically pulls in some financial terminology and applies it to comics. And I always think that that's kind of fun. But the blogger basically talks about something called the Rule of 72. And in the blog post, they break down this term and apply it to comics and actually makes some recommendations for why this rule is relevant to us as comic book collectors. And if you've never heard this term before, in layman's terms, what it really means is how long will it take someone to double their investment? Long and short, that's basically what it is. And as I mentioned, the blogger does a really good job of breaking the term down, and in the blog post examines 4 books that are pretty hot right now and evaluates how long it will take someone to double their money on these books based upon the current returns that are being seen. The very first book that the blogger looks at is Ultimate Fallout issue number 4. At an 8.5, this book has a current year return of 41.4%. Using those numbers, it would basically take someone 1.73 years to actually double their money. Next up, Secret Wars issue number 8. At an 8.5 and a 21.2% current year return, it would take someone roughly 3.39 years to double their money. And so the blogger goes on to basically make the recommendation that if you're interested in doubling your money, the book that you might want to go with is the Fantastic Four issue number 52, the first appearance of Black Panther. Why? You need to read the blog post to determine that. The very last blog post that we are going to talk about just makes me smile. And it makes me smile because in this post, the blogger highlights that they recently did a deep dive into their own collection and had a few epiphanies based upon an annual review of their collection. And during this annual review, they basically identified a couple of newsstand comics that have performed incredibly well for them, right? That have performed better than maybe what they expected. And these books actually have a little bit of a premium associated with them. And what I also like about this blog post is that the blogger takes some time to explain the differences between newsstand and direct and highlights why not all newsstands are created equally. And so to that point, the blogger goes on to look at the rate of return of newsstand comics versus direct comics for some pretty popular comics. That being Amazing Spider-Man issue number 238, the first appearance of the Hobgoblin, Amazing Spider-Man issue number 300, the first appearance of Venom, and also Amazing Spider-Man issue number 361, the first appearance of Carnage. Now, what's interesting about this is that the direct editions in many cases actually outperformed the newsstand. And that's a little contrarian for a lot of people because folks in many ways attach a premium to newsstand comics. I want to encourage you to check this blog post out because some of the data here could be surprising. As I've mentioned before, this blog post is linked down in the description. So there you have it. We have reached the end of another recap video, and I hope that you enjoyed this recap. And if you did, I want to encourage you to hit the thumbs up button and leave a comment behind so we can mix it up in the comment section. I also want to encourage you to come back next week when we get to do this all over again.